The night began like any other typical Friday. Martin and his girlfriend Paula were excited to attend the late-night showing of a cult horror movie at their favorite theater. It wasn't one of those modern and polished complexes, but rather an old and worn-down cinema on the outskirts of the city, with red velvet seats that creaked when you moved, and a dimly lit lobby that smelled of popcorn and something else indefinable. They loved it for the atmosphere, raw and authentic, the perfect setting to watch something scary. The theater was almost empty, with only a few scattered viewers in the dimly lit room. As they sat in the middle row, Paula whispered to Martin, "I feel like we're the only ones here." Martin smiled and wrapped his arm around her. "Better, that way we'll be more scared," he replied. The previews ended and the lights dimmed even more. The movie began with a bone-chilling scream that made them both jump in their seats. They laughed nervously, but something wasn't right. The sound hadn't come from the speakers, it sounded real. Paula looked around, scanning the rows of seats, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for the unsettling feeling that someone was watching them. Midway through the movie, Paula nudged Martin. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the corner of the screen. At first, Martin didn't notice anything unusual, but then a figure appeared walking in the background of a scene behind the actors. It wasn't part of the movie, and it definitely shouldn't have been there. The figure was wearing an old-fashioned usher's uniform, with a red jacket, gold trim, and a cap. It seemed to be strolling behind the characters, but none of the actors reacted to its presence. "It must be a mistake," Martin said, trying to shake off the discomfort. Minutes later, the usher appeared again, but this time in the seats of the theater shown in the movie. He sat down, crossed his legs, adjusted his jacket collar, and stared directly at the camera, as if he could see the audience watching him. His face was alarmingly blank, with wide-open, fixed eyes. He didn't fit in with the movie at all. Paula squeezed Martin's arm harder. "This is freaking me out. I don't remember this part." "Maybe it's some director's cut," Martin suggested, though even he didn't believe what he was saying. The figure was too real, too eerie to be part of the script. Suddenly, the movie flickered, and for a brief moment the screen went black. When the film resumed, the usher had disappeared. Relieved, Martin tried to relax, but then Paula gasped, digging her nails into his arm. "Martin, look," she pointed toward the back of their own theater, just behind the projector. A dark figure was standing in the aisle, motionless as if waiting. Martin squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was dressed just like the usher in the movie, with the same vacant expression. But this time it wasn't on the screen. It was standing in their theater. "It can't be," Martin whispered, feeling his pulse quicken. He looked around, but the other viewers didn't seem to notice anything. Or maybe they were pretending not to see it. He couldn't tell. Every instinct told him to leave, but he didn't want to seem foolish. It was probably some twisted prank. Yes, that had to be it. But then the figure moved slowly, deliberately, walking down the aisle toward the middle row toward them. Martin held his breath as the figure's empty eyes locked onto his. He leaned toward Paula, who was frozen in her seat, her face pale. The figure stopped just 2 rows behind them, standing between the seats, staring directly at them. The air in the theater turned cold, the oppressive silence broken only by the muffled sounds of the movie still playing on the screen. No one else seemed to notice the figure. Martin glanced over his shoulder again. The figure was gone. "Paula," Martin whispered, his voice trembling, "we have to get out of here." Before she could respond, the theater lights flickered violently, and then the screen went black again. This time it stayed that way. The only light came from the emergency exit signs, casting a faint glow over the now eerily silent room. Everyone around them shifted uncomfortably, murmuring to one another, confused. Martin stood up, his legs shaky. "Let's go," he urged. Paula nodded, and they hurried toward the exit, their eyes darting nervously around the theater, expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. When they reached the lobby, the elderly man at the concession stand called out to them, "Leaving already?" "The movie's not over." Martin shook his head, a chill running down his spine. "Something strange is going on in there." The old man smiled, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling sharpness. "You saw him, didn't you?" Martin froze. "What do you mean?" The old man chuckled softly. "The guy in the uniform. He's been hanging around for weeks, dressing up as an old usher and sneaking into the late-night showings. No one knows who he is, but it's not the first time he's spooked the customers." Paula tugged on Martin's arm. Let's get out of here. They hurried out of the theater, their footsteps echoing in the lonely parking lot. As they reached the car, Paula glanced back at the building. Through the glass doors, she could see the faint silhouette of the man in costume, standing at the edge of the lobby, watching them leave. And Paula couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly alone, no matter how far they got. Neither could Martine forget the man's empty eyes, that unnerving expression that would haunt him. A terrifying reminder that some horrors are more real than they seem. Tyler had worked at the cinema for several months before noticing something strange. The theater, built in the 30s, had a vintage charm that attracted small crowds. However, the night shifts always had something different about them. It was a quiet place during the day, but at night the empty theater and the dark lobby took on a more unsettling atmosphere. On one particularly slow night, Tyler was alone. He was in charge of closing, and the last showing had ended over an hour ago. The few people who attended the horror movie had left quickly, leaving him in complete silence. He locked the main doors and began his usual cleaning routine. The hum of the old air conditioner echoed in the background, and the lobby was barely lit by the emergency lights. The cinema had a long hallway that led to the projection rooms. As he made his way there, Tyler felt a chill. It wasn't the first time he had experienced that sensation, but this time it was more intense. When he reached the main theater to check that everything was in order, he heard a sound. Footsteps. At first he thought it was his imagination, but the sound was clear and came from inside the theater. He turned on his flashlight and ventured in. His footsteps echoed on the sticky floor, covered in popcorn. As he shone the light over the rows of seats, he saw no one, but something made him stop. In the last row, a figure was seated, hunched over as if it had been waiting. Tyler froze. He was sure he had locked the doors and that everyone had left. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't respond or move. Tyler took a few steps toward the last row, trying to calm himself. "We're closed, you have to leave," he said more firmly. But when he shone the light on the seat, there was no one there. Confused and scared, he hurried out of the theater. He headed to the projection room to turn off the equipment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When he got there, he switched off the projector and, as he turned toward the door, he heard footsteps again, this time right behind him. Panic overtook him, but when he turned on the flashlight, there was no one. He ran toward the hallway, feeling the lights flicker around him. He quickened his pace, urgently needing to get out of the theater as quickly as possible. Suddenly, he heard a whisper, "Tyler." He froze. The sound was coming from in front of him, not behind. He raised the flashlight and saw a man at the end of the hallway, dressed in an old, disheveled, and dirty theater uniform. The figure started walking slowly toward him. Tyler felt his heart race, and before he could think twice, he ran toward the lobby. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and rushed outside. The cool air hit him like a slap, but he didn't look back. When he finally reached his car, he looked back at the theater and saw through the glass doors the man standing inside, watching him with a twisted smile on his face. Tyler never worked there again. He quit the next day and moved far away. Although he tried to forget, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching him at all times, waiting for the chance to meet him again. It was a quiet Tuesday night, and Gabriella had decided to go to the movies alone. It wasn't something she usually did, but after a long and stressful day at work, she needed an escape. The theater was one of those small, independent places in the city center, with only a few screens and almost no staff. She liked it because it was always nearly empty, and that night was no different. When she walked in, there were only a couple of people scattered around the seats. She bought her ticket, grabbed some popcorn, and settled into her favorite spot right in the center, halfway down the theater. The movie was a thriller, something about a crime in a small town, but Gabriella was having trouble concentrating. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The theater was too quiet. Yes, it was a weekday night and there were only a few people watching the movie, but the silence felt unsettling. The scenes flashed by quickly, but the slight unease she had felt at the beginning turned into something much stronger. She kept looking around, feeling as if someone was watching her. But every time she did, the others seemed focused on the movie. Halfway through the film, Gabriella noticed someone sitting a few rows behind her. They were hunched over in their seat, and at first she didn't think much of it. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them move slowly, deliberately. They sat up a little straighter, and Gabriella could feel their gaze fixed on the back of her head. She tried to focus on the movie, but now she couldn't. Her pulse quickened, and she cautiously looked back again. The figure was sitting completely still, their face hidden in the shadows of the dimly lit theater. It was hard to tell if they were looking at her or not, but the way they were positioned made her feel as though they hadn't taken their eyes off her. Gabriella shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her body. The theater felt colder, much colder than it had when she sat down. She tried telling herself it was all in her head, that she was just being paranoid. But when she looked back at the screen, she still felt that gaze boring into her. Minutes passed, and the strange figure behind her didn't move. Gabriella's discomfort turned into full-blown panic. She couldn't stay there any longer. The air felt too thick, the darkness too oppressive. She grabbed her bag and stood up, intending to head to the lobby for a breath of air. But as she did, the figure behind her stood up as well. Her heart raced as she quickly walked toward the aisle, trying not to make it obvious that she was leaving. She hurried toward the exit, but just before reaching the door, she made the mistake of glancing over her shoulder. The figure was following her. Gabriella's breath caught in her throat as she pushed the door and ran into the hallway. The lobby was completely empty, the dim lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her footsteps echoed on the tiled floor as she headed toward the bathroom, hoping to escape the presence following her. Maybe they would just walk past, and she would laugh at herself for being so paranoid. She slipped into the bathroom and locked the door of one of the stalls, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was suffocating. Gabriella leaned against the cold tiled wall, trying to regulate her breathing. Then she heard it. The faint creak of the bathroom door opening. Someone had followed her. Gabriella looked through the small gap in the stall door, her pulse roaring in her ears. The man was there, right inside the bathroom, completely still, staring at the mirror. He was dressed in dark clothes, his head bowed as if looking at the sink in front of him. His breathing was slow, deliberate. Gabriella covered her mouth, trying not to make a sound. The man didn't move, just stood there as if waiting for something or someone. Minutes passed, but to Gabriella they felt like hours. Her legs ached from standing still, her knees trembling with fear. She knew she couldn't stay there forever, but leaving seemed just as dangerous. Suddenly the bathroom lights flickered just for a moment, enough to send a wave of terror through her. When the lights steadied, Gabriella looked through the gap again. The man was gone. Her breath stopped. The bathroom was completely empty. She cautiously pushed open the stall door, her whole body tense. The air felt heavy and the silence was suffocating. Gabriella stepped toward the sink, her heart pounding in her ears. She needed to get out of there now. Just as she reached the door, her eyes caught something in the mirror. Behind her, only inches away, stood the man. His face was pale and gaunt, with a menacing look. His eyes were fixed on her, and his mouth twisted into a crooked smile. Gabriella screamed and ran out of the bathroom, her shoes squeaking on the slippery floor as she sprinted toward the lobby. But when she burst into the open area, it was empty, completely deserted. The ticket booth was closed, and the concession stand was dark. It was as if the whole theater had shut down while she was in the bathroom. Her heart pounded as she scanned the lobby, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, the lobby lights flickered, and the door to the theater behind her opened slowly, deliberately. Gabriella backed away, her breathing shallow and ragged. She turned to run toward the main doors, but the glass doors were locked. She pounded on the doors desperately, but no one came. Then she heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the empty lobby. He was coming. Gabriella turned, but there was no one, only the dark hallways leading deeper into the theater. The footsteps grew closer and then stopped. Gabriella's chest tightened, paralyzed by the fear that she wasn't alone. Something was watching her, waiting just beyond the shadows, and it wasn't going to leave. The small-town cinema was a relic from the 1950s, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. Though it was in bad shape, it still had a certain charm that attracted Jenny and her friends, Matteo and Sofia. That night, they decided to stop by the theater to watch a midnight horror movie marathon, something they thought would be fun to pass the time. They bought their tickets from an elderly man at the booth who handed them the tickets without saying a word, his face wrinkled and tired. The lobby was practically empty, save for a few scattered patrons. The air smelled musty and like stale popcorn. "Are we the only ones crazy enough to come here?" Mateo joked as they walked toward the screening room. The theater itself was dimly lit, with faded red velvet seats and a screen showing signs of wear. They sat in the center of the cinema, noticing that there were only a few other people in the room, some in the back and others near the front. The first movie started, but Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Although the film was old and creepy, what really unsettled her was the atmosphere in the theater. Too quiet, almost deserted. The hum of the projector and the long shadows created a sense of unease. Midway through the movie, Jenny turned to say something to Sophia, but stopped abruptly. Sophia was completely still, staring blankly at the screen, her eyes wide open but without any expression. "Sophia, are you okay?" Jenny whispered as she touched her arm. Sophia didn't respond or move, as if she hadn't heard her. Her breathing was shallow and her gaze remained fixed on the screen. "Mateo," Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong with Sophia. She's not moving." Mateo leaned toward them, touching Sophia's arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, but still there was no response. Just as he was about to shake her, a shadow moved in the last row of the theater. Jenny looked back, and although she couldn't see clearly, she was sure someone was standing there watching them from the shadows. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the back of the theater. Mateo turned to look, and when he did, he went pale. "There's someone there," he whispered, visibly tense. Suddenly, the theater lights flickered, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. When the light stabilized, the other people in the theater had vanished. The seats that were occupied moments ago were now empty. Jenny felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. "Mateo, we need to leave," she said quietly, trying to stay calm. They both stood up quickly, but when they tried to lift Sophia, she remained unmoving, as if she were in shock. At that moment, they saw the figure in the last row of the theater. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing with a cap pulled low over his face. The man began to walk toward them, moving slowly between the seats. Jenny's heart raced as she tugged on Mateo's arm. "We need to get out of here now," she screamed, but the exit door was blocked. Mateo tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Just then, the man was only a few feet away from them. Without a word, he raised his hand, revealing a gun hidden under his coat. "Stay still," the man ordered in a threatening whisper. Jenny felt all the air leave her body. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a horror movie. They were trapped with a man who wouldn't hesitate to use force. "We're going to make this easy," the man said as he grabbed Sophia by the arm, forcing her to stand. Sophia, still in shock, was dragged without resistance. Jenny and Mateo were paralyzed with fear. The man gave them one last look before heading toward a side door, taking Sophia with him. "If you try anything, you won't live to tell about it," he warned before disappearing into the darkness. When the doors finally unlocked and the theater fell silent, Jenny and Mateo ran for the exit, not stopping until they reached the car. Sophia was gone, and although the police investigated, they never found any trace of her or the man who had abducted her. The theater closed a few weeks later, but the memory of that night was etched into them forever. It was a rainy Friday night when Alejandro and his girlfriend Emma decided to go to the movies for a last-minute showing. They hadn't planned on going out that night, but after several days stuck at home due to the bad weather, they wanted to get away for a while. The cinema was on a quiet street, an old place they had never been to before. It had a vintage marquee and a retro vibe, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. When they arrived, there were only a few cars in the parking lot, and inside it was almost empty. The ticket booth attendant was a middle-aged man who looked tired, as if he had been working there for decades. He barely glanced at them as he sold them tickets for the horror movie that was playing. Inside the theater was just as deserted. The lights were dim, and the place smelled like old carpet and popcorn that had been sitting in the machines for hours. Alejandro and Emma found seats in the middle row, right in the center. As the previews played, only 2 or 3 more people entered and sat at the back. The rain gently tapped against the windows, creating a rhythm that was almost soothing. The movie started, and for the first half hour everything seemed normal. The film was a typical thriller and Alejandro was starting to enjoy it. But then he noticed something strange. At first it was subtle. Alejandro saw that a man sitting in the last row was moving oddly. Instead of focusing on the movie, the man was looking around, observing the other moviegoers, especially them. Emma didn't notice at first, but Alejandro felt a growing discomfort. "Did you notice that guy?" Alejandro whispered, discreetly nodding toward the back. Emma glanced briefly but didn't see anything unusual. "He doesn't seem to be watching the movie," Alejandro continued. Emma tried to relax, but now she too felt uneasy. The man in the last row kept watching them. He wasn't looking at the movie, he was just staring at the row where Alejandro and Emma were sitting. He didn't take his eyes off them, his expression unreadable. This wasn't normal. Alejandro tried to ignore it, but he could feel the man's gaze growing heavier. When the movie reached its climax, Alejandro noticed that the man slowly stood up. At first, he thought the man was going to the bathroom or to get something, but he didn't head for any of the side exits. Instead, he started walking toward the front, directly toward them. "Emma, that guy is walking toward us," Alejandro said, his voice trembling. Emma looked at him, scared. The man walked with slow, deliberate steps, keeping his gaze fixed on them. "What the hell is he doing?" Emma muttered, trying not to panic. The man reached the front row and stopped. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his head slightly tilted toward them. His presence was suffocating. No one else seemed to notice what was happening, but Alejandro and Emma were on high alert. "We need to get out of here," Emma whispered, trying to stay calm. Alejandro nodded, and they both carefully stood up, walking slowly toward the side exit. But just as they started to move, the man took a step toward them. "Run," Alejandro said in a low voice, grabbing Emma's hand. They hurried toward the lobby, but when they got there, they realized no one else was around. The concession stand was closed, and the ticket booth attendant had disappeared. "Where is everyone?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Let's get out of here," Alejandro replied, pulling her toward the main door. But when they reached it, the door was locked. No matter how hard they pushed or pulled, the door wouldn't budge. Panic took over Alejandro as he desperately searched for another exit. Just as he did, the lights flickered and the man from the last row appeared in the lobby. He stood there, staring at them with the same blank expression. He didn't move, but his presence filled the room with a sense of menace. Alejandro grabbed Emma and they ran toward the emergency exit on one side of the lobby. They managed to open the door, and the cold night air hit them as they stumbled out into the alley. They didn't stop running until they were halfway down the street, the rain soaking them to the bone. When they finally dared to look back, the cinema remained in the distance, with the neon sign flickering in the rain. The door they had just escaped through was wide open. The man wasn't following them, but his figure stayed in their minds like a dark, looming presence. It was supposed to be a fun night. A small independent cinema in the city was hosting a special screening of a controversial movie that had been pulled after several incidents during its showings. Rumors about the film spoke of serious technical issues, fainting viewers, and even reports of disappearances during the screenings. Valeria and her friends, horror movie fans, were intrigued by the opportunity to watch something so rare. The cinema had an old, worn-down look, with its flickering neon marquee and a facade weathered by time. When they arrived, Valeria, Martine, and their friends noticed that while the place wasn't crowded, it had more people than they had expected for such a peculiar screening. They entered the lobby where the dim lighting and old carpets created a slightly unsettling atmosphere. The ticket booth attendant, an older man with an expressionless face, handed them their tickets without saying a word, which seemed strange but fitting for the theater's ambiance. The inside of the cinema was no different from the outside. Faded red velvet seats, dull yellow walls, and a large screen showing signs of wear. They settled into the center of the theater, excited but unable to ignore the slight discomfort the dimly lit place provoked. The few people seated in other rows were quiet, almost motionless, adding to the strange atmosphere. The movie started without issue, though the visual and sound quality was mediocre, which only heightened the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The film, a psychological thriller, seemed to escalate in tension, but what disturbed Valeria the most was the atmosphere inside the cinema. The room was too quiet, and the still, silent figures in the seats gave her a growing sense of discomfort. About 20 minutes in, Valeria was the first to notice something odd. Someone in the last row stood up. At first she thought it was someone going to the bathroom, but the figure didn't move. They just stood there, motionless. "Do you see that?" Valeria whispered to Martine, pointing to the back of the theater. Martine looked but didn't pay much attention. "Probably just someone weird. Focus on the movie," he responded quietly, trying to ignore the unease that was beginning to build in both of them. However, the movie started to become confusing. The scenes didn't seem to follow a logical sequence, and some characters appeared and disappeared without reason. The voices became distorted, mixed with sounds that didn't belong to the film. At one point, Valeria could swear she heard her own name among the whispers, but she tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Then the screen flickered, and for a brief moment the movie changed. Instead of the actors, the image showed the theater itself, as if a camera were filming live from somewhere inside the room. Valeria and her friends saw themselves on the screen, sitting in the center, motionless. The camera zoomed in on them and the knot in her stomach tightened. "This isn't part of the movie, is it?" Valeria asked, feeling her breathing quicken. Martine was just as baffled. They didn't know if it was a prank or some trick of the special screening. The image on the screen continued to show the audience, but when the camera focused on the back rows, something disturbing happened. The people who had been seated started to stand up, but not in a normal way. Their movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and their heads were tilted unnaturally, hiding their faces. Martine grabbed Valeria's hand. "This is really weird, let's get out of here." When they stood up, they realized something even worse. The figures standing in the back now blocked the exit. They remained there, motionless, as if they were waiting for something or someone. Valeria felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the other spectators in the rows weren't moving, as if they were frozen in their seats. "I don't like this," Valeria muttered, her pulse racing. They tried to head for the side exit, but the figures in the back began to slowly advance, cutting off their path. Their movements were clumsy, but at the same time calculated, making them seem even more menacing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint whispers that intensified as the figures drew closer. Valeria and Martine ran toward the emergency exit. The lobby was deserted, the concession stand empty, but the main doors seemed to be locked. The other spectators remained in their seats, as if nothing was affecting them. As they ran, the whispers grew louder, but when they reached the exit door, it was locked. Martine started pounding on the door desperately as Valeria looked for another way out. Suddenly, the theater lights went out completely, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The whispers stopped, and a deep silence fell over the cinema. The lights suddenly flickered back on, and the theater was completely empty. The figures that had been following them were gone. The movie on the screen had disappeared, and the projector was off. Everything was silent, as if no one had ever been there. Breathing heavily, Valeria and Martine ran into the lobby, but it was also empty. The dim lights cast eerie shadows, and the feeling of being trapped overwhelmed them. The outside of the cinema was eerily calm, as if the night itself was watching them. When they reached the parking lot, Valeria looked back one last time. The theater's marquee still flickered with the movie title, but something about the building seemed darker now, more threatening. And as they drove away, Valeria couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, that the special screening wasn't over for them. And somewhere in the shadows, those figures were still watching, waiting for their next showing. There was a small cinema on the outskirts of town that no one ever mentioned. It had been closed for years, boarded up after a tragic accident that claimed several lives. Despite that, every so often people claimed to have seen lights turn on or heard strange sounds. The rumors always spoke of a dangerous place, somewhere best avoided. One night, Esteban and his friends Camila, Diego, and Rocio decided to challenge the legend. They saw it as the perfect opportunity, an abandoned theater with a tragic past and the mystery of whether the stories were true. With their adrenaline running high, they piled into Esteban's car and drove to the old building. When they arrived, the cinema's facade made them feel like they had traveled back in time. Dust-covered windows, a chained-up entrance, and a broken neon sign gave the impression that the place had been abandoned for decades. "It's like no one's been here in years," Diego said, shining his flashlight on the building's exterior. "Perfect setting for a horror movie, right?" Camilla joked, though her tone betrayed her discomfort. Esteban found a broken window they could use to get inside. The air inside was thick, heavy with dust, humidity, and a strange smell of decay. The entire place was in ruins. Despite the feeling of abandonment, the most unsettling thing was that the projector was running. From the hallway, they could see the flicker of light and hear the soft whir of the reel. Guided by curiosity, they entered the main theater. The seats were moldy and worn, and the screen was projecting a black and white film that looked blurry and disturbing. The images seemed distorted, as if they had been filmed a long time ago and were deteriorating. "Who's running the projector?" Diego asked nervously. "This is getting weird," Esteban muttered, walking closer to the screen to get a better look. The friend sat down, drawn to the strange film. The images showed dark, empty places. A hallway, a door slowly opening, blurred figures moving in the background. The sounds from the movie were equally unsettling. Creaks and whispers that seemed to come from the corners of the theater. "I don't like this," Rocio whispered, unable to look away from the screen. "There's something strange about this." "Relax," Esteban replied, though he himself was feeling an increasing sense of unease. "It's just an old movie." But as the movie progressed, they realized something chilling. The images they were seeing were too familiar. The hallway that appeared on the screen was the same one they had walked through to enter. The door slowly opening was the same one they had used to come into the theater. Then the figures appeared. At first they were just blurry shadows, but the camera zoomed in, revealing 4 people standing in the hallway, nervous and unsure. It was them. Esteban, Camila, Diego, and Rocio, standing in the same clothes they were wearing that night. "Turn it off," Rocio exclaimed, her voice trembling. "It's not me," Esteban said, stepping back. The screen flickered and changed again. Now the film showed the group entering the theater, sitting in exactly the same seats they were in at that moment. The camera zoomed in on their terrified faces. "Who's filming this?" Camila asked, clutching Esteban's arm. The projector flickered again, and the movie jumped to another scene. The figures on the screen were still them, but now their expressions were blank, almost robotic. Standing behind them in the shadows were human figures, slowly moving toward them. The theater was filled with an oppressive cold. Esteban stood up quickly. "We need to go." The figures on the screen mirrored their movements. Esteban and the others had barely made it halfway down the aisle when the movie showed the figures closing in. Footsteps echoed in the theater. It wasn't just the film. Someone else was in the cinema, following them. "Someone's here," Diego whispered. "We need to get out now." The group ran to the exit, but when they reached the door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. "It's stuck," Camila screamed. "It won't open." As they pounded desperately on the door, the human figures that had appeared in the movie began to appear in real life, emerging from the shadows of the theater. They were people, men and women dressed in black, with masks covering their faces. They were the kidnappers, the ones who had set everything up to lure them into the cinema. "They're hunting us," Rocio cried, frozen with fear. Just before they were caught, the projector stopped, but for the group, the nightmare had only just begun. It was a rainy night when Amelia parked her car in front of the almost abandoned cinema on the outskirts of the city. She had heard stories about the place, a tragic fire that caused several deaths during a screening many years ago, but that didn't bother her. She was just looking for a break from the stress of the week. The cinema was showing old films, and that night's movie was one of her favorites, a nostalgic story she had watched countless times. The fact that the theater was nearly empty only made it more appealing. She ran to the entrance through the rain, pulling her coat tight against the cold wind. The ticket booth, a small glass cubicle worn down by time, was manned by an old woman who barely looked up when Amelia approached. "1 ticket for the quiet movie," she said, handing over the money. The woman only grunted and handed her the ticket without a word. Something about her gaze unsettled Amelia, but she ignored it. Maybe the woman was just tired or simply uninterested. The lobby was dimly lit, and the old, stained red carpets made the place feel even more outdated. There was no one at the concession stand, but Amelia grabbed a bag of popcorn from a nearby shelf and left a few bills on the counter before heading toward the screening room. The theater was almost empty. She only saw a few people scattered in the rows closest to the screen. It was strange because she hadn't seen anyone else in the lobby, but she didn't think much of it. Maybe they had arrived much earlier. She sat in a middle row, ready to enjoy the movie. The preview started, but something didn't feel right. The silence in the room was oppressive, too heavy for a place like that. The rain tapped against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that contrasted with the stillness of the figures in the seats. Amelia looked more closely at the figure sitting in the front row. They were completely motionless, not shifting in their seat or changing posture, as if they were a mannequin. A chill ran down her spine, but she tried to ignore it. She focused on the movie, though the unease continued to grow. As the movie progressed, the figures in the rows seemed to disappear. Every time she looked around, there were fewer people in the theater. Had they left? When? She hadn't seen anyone get up or leave. Suddenly, the ceiling lights flickered, and the movie stopped for a moment before the screen went completely dark. Amelia jumped, and when the lights came back on, the seats were empty. The figures that had been there were gone. Her heart began to race. She slowly stood up, her legs trembling. She looked around, searching for some sign of what had happened. There was no one. The theater was deserted. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. There was no response. Suddenly, the screen flickered back on, but it wasn't showing the movie she had come to see. Instead, it displayed a grainy image of the theater's lobby, the same one she had walked through minutes earlier. Amelia looked toward the projection room, expecting to see the operator, but there was no one. The camera on the screen zoomed in on the ticket booth, but the old woman was no longer there. Amelia swallowed hard, feeling her anxiety rise. Then the image changed again. The camera was now focusing on the screening room where she was. It slowly panned across the empty rows, getting closer to her seat. Panic seized Amelia. She looked around, sensing that something was wrong, but she couldn't see anyone in the shadows. The camera on the screen kept advancing until it stopped in front of her seat, showing her standing there, terrified. She ran toward the door, but just as she reached it, it slammed shut with a loud bang. She desperately tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "What's happening?" she murmured, panic rising. She looked back at the screen. Now the image showed someone else in the theater. A dark figure stood at the back of the room, slowly approaching where she was. The camera zoomed in, and although she couldn't see the figure's face, she felt an imminent threat. Amelia turned abruptly but saw no one. Terrified, she ran toward the emergency exit on the side of the theater, but when she got there, that door was also locked. None of the exits worked. The screen flickered again. The dark figure was now closer to her on the screen, moving with slow, deliberate steps. Amelia tried to scream, but fear paralyzed her. The theater was plunged into complete darkness. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the door. But there was no response. A loud click broke the silence, and a dim light illuminated the screen again. Amelia, panting, slowly turned toward the screen, and what she saw froze her in place. The dark figure had disappeared from the image. In its place, the projector now showed the theater's live security cameras. She saw the empty lobby, the abandoned concession stand, and finally the camera focused on the back exit. There stood a man, motionless, watching the doors with a disturbing calm. Amelia backed away slowly, feeling that something or someone was stalking her in the darkness. Suddenly the monitors went black again, and at that moment, the silence in the theater became more oppressive until she heard a dull thud coming from the hallway. A footstep, then another. Someone was approaching. Her breathing became erratic. She was trapped. Desperately, she tried to open the emergency door again, pushing with all her strength, but nothing moved. The figure she had seen on the screen was getting closer. She knew time was running out. Desperate, she tried to move to the other side of the theater, pushing through the seats as her feet stumbled in the dark. Then something stopped her. She could feel that she wasn't alone in that empty theater. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, clearer, until they stopped. Amelia stood still, paralyzed with fear. She couldn't see her pursuer, but she could feel their presence right behind her. Suddenly, the theater lights flickered again, and the screen lit up with one final image. It was her, captured by a hidden camera in the room, with the shadowy figure standing just a few feet away. An indescribable cold ran through her body. The figure was closer than she had thought. With one last effort, she ran toward the main entrance, hearing the echo of her footsteps growing louder, as if someone was following close behind. She reached the main door and with trembling hands pounded on it with all her might. Then, in a desperate turn, the door gave way, and Amelia stumbled into the empty lobby, her heart pounding. The theater was still silent, but she knew she couldn't stop. She ran out into the torrential rain, and when she finally looked back, she saw the cinema door slowly closing. The figure in the dark continued watching her, but it was no longer a shadow. Now it was a man, a human being, someone who had been stalking her the entire time. When she reached her car, Amelia realized she had never been alone. Someone had been watching her from the beginning, and the real fear wasn't in the cinema, but in what she hadn't seen until now. It was a late-night screening at a small independent cinema in the city center. The theater had seen better days. The seats were old and squeaky, the walls were covered in faded movie posters, and the air smelled like a mix of stale popcorn and dampness. For Marina, it was her favorite place. She loved the feeling of getting lost in a movie, as if the outside world disappeared for a while. That night, she arrived just before the previews began. There were only a few people scattered throughout the room, which she loved. She bought her ticket, grabbed a bucket of popcorn, and found a seat in the center, her usual spot. The movie was a psychological thriller. Marina immersed herself in the story, enjoying the quiet of the room. But after about 20 minutes, she started feeling something strange, a sense of unease she couldn't ignore. She felt like someone was watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she finally gave in to the need to glance behind her. A couple of rows back, she saw a man. He was leaning forward in his seat, staring in her direction. Even though the theater was dark, she could clearly see his silhouette. What disturbed her was that the man wasn't watching the screen, he was watching her. Marina quickly looked back toward the front, her pulse racing. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that maybe the man was just lost in thought, looking in her direction by chance. But the paranoia began to take over, and she could no longer focus on the movie. The sound of a rustle behind her made her tense up. The man had moved. Marina felt a wave of discomfort, knowing she shouldn't look again. But the need to confirm what was happening was too strong. She slowly turned her head. Now the man was sitting more upright, clearly staring at her, with a disturbing expression on his face. She quickly faced forward again, breathing deeply. What should she do? She didn't want to confront him, but she couldn't just sit there ignoring what was happening. Trying to calm herself, she focused on the movie, though she could barely follow the plot. But then the screen flickered. The movie stuttered, and for a moment the image froze. Marina looked around, but no one seemed to have noticed the glitch. Everyone was focused on the film, except her. She felt like she was losing control, as if reality around her was starting to unravel. Then a louder rustling sound startled her again. Her heart raced. She felt something behind her, but didn't want to turn around this time. The fear of seeing the man closer was overwhelming. She decided she couldn't stay any longer. She slowly stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked toward the exit as calmly as possible. She reached the lobby, but it was completely empty. The lights were dim and the air was cold. The concession stand was closed and there was no one at the ticket booth. The silence was almost absolute. Marina tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just her imagination. But when she looked back toward the theater, she saw something that stopped her cold. Through the glass door, she saw a dark figure moving down the hallway toward the theater exit. The man was following her. Adrenaline hit her, and without a second thought, she ran toward the main door. But when she reached it, the door was locked. Panic consumed her. How could it be locked? Marina searched for another exit, running to the end of the lobby. Just as she was about to reach a side door, the sound of quick footsteps behind her made her spin around. The man was there, just a few meters away, walking slowly toward her with a cold, calculating expression. With trembling hands, she tried to open the side door, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The man kept approaching, and Marina felt like she couldn't breathe. Just as she was about to scream, the sound of a door opening at the far end of the lobby broke the tension. A theater employee appeared, oblivious to what was happening. "Is everything okay?" the employee asked, confused. Marina looked at him, still terrified, but when she glanced back at the man, he was no longer there. Confusion washed over her, but she didn't waste time explaining. She just wanted to get out of there. Finally, the employee opened the main door and Marina stepped outside, the cold wind hitting her face. She hurried to her car, constantly glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see the man coming out of the theater. But he didn't appear. She got into her car and started the engine, speeding away from the place as fast as she could. With trembling hands gripping the steering wheel, she tried to calm herself, telling herself it had all been just a strange coincidence. But just as she stopped at a traffic light, something in the rearview mirror made her freeze. In the back seat, hidden in the shadows, she saw a silhouette. Her breath caught, and before she could react, A hand reached out from the shadows, covering her mouth as the man in the back seat whispered, "Relax. Now you can't escape." It was Friday night, and Leonardo had just left the office after a long week of work. The city's old cinema was offering a special midnight screening of a classic horror film, and he thought it would be the perfect distraction to forget about the stress of work. The cinema, known for its rundown appearance and peculiar atmosphere, seemed like the ideal place to watch a horror movie alone. Leonardo arrived at the desolate parking lot and bought his ticket from a teenager who barely looked up from his phone. He entered the building where the flickering lights cast long shadows on the old carpet. The lobby was almost empty. A few people wandered around, but the atmosphere was strange, as if the entire place was stuck in time. The cinema, with its rows of red velvet-covered seats and dark walls, gave him a cozy yet somewhat unsettling feeling. He sat in the center of the theater, where he had the best view of the screen, and noticed that only a few other people were scattered in the seats. The movie began, and Leonardo relaxed, getting absorbed in the story. However, after about 20 minutes, he started to feel a strange discomfort. The air felt colder, much colder than he remembered. He shifted in his seat, but the sensation didn't go away. Then he noticed it. A man in a dark hoodie was sitting a few rows ahead of him. He didn't recall seeing him when he first entered. At first he didn't think much of it, but the more he watched, the stranger it seemed. The man didn't move at all. He was completely still, his hood pulled low over his face. His posture, completely rigid, was almost unnatural, and something about the way he was sitting deeply unsettled Leonardo. He tried to focus on the movie again, but his attention kept drifting back to the man. It seemed like he wasn't even watching the film. Instead of moving or reacting to the scenes, he remained frozen, staring straight ahead without blinking. Leonardo started to wonder if he was there for the movie or for something else. The atmosphere in the theater became more oppressive. Suddenly the screen flickered, plunging the cinema into darkness for a few seconds. Leonardo's heart raced. When the movie resumed, the man in the hoodie was gone. Leonardo looked around, trying to spot him, but there was no sign of him anywhere in the theater. How had he left so quickly without making a sound? The tension inside him grew as he tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. 10 minutes passed, and although the movie continued, the feeling that something wasn't right never left him. Then it happened again. The screen flickered, but this time it didn't return to the movie. Instead, a black and white image of the same theater he was sitting in appeared. Leonardo froze when he saw the screen. The camera was slowly panning across the empty rows of seats, showing the few remaining viewers. And then the camera stopped. It stopped right on him, focusing directly on his seat in the center of the room. His heart pounded as he saw his own image projected on the screen. He looked around, searching for some sign that the other viewers had noticed the change on the screen, but no one else seemed to realize it. Everyone was absorbed in the movie as if nothing had happened. Fear washed over him as he looked back at the screen where something new had appeared. In the corner of the theater next to the exit door was the man in the hoodie, standing still, staring directly at him. Leonardo felt a knot form in his stomach. He turned his head, looking for the man in reality, and there he was, standing by the exit, completely motionless. Panic took over him. He quickly stood up from his seat, determined to leave as fast as possible. He hurried toward the exit, but the ceiling lights began to flicker, casting flashes that made the hallway stretch and shrink with each blink. In every flash of darkness, the man in the hoodie seemed to move closer. First, standing at the bottom of the stairs, then in the aisle, and then even closer. With every flicker of light, he was nearer, though still motionless when the lights came back on. Leonardo pushed through the side door and stepped into the hallway, his breathing fast and shallow. The sound of his own footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, but then he heard something else, another set of footsteps heavy following him. He didn't dare look back. He ran toward the emergency door at the end of the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. When he pushed the door, he burst out into the cold night air. The rain was pouring down, drenching him as he ran toward his car. When he reached the car, he threw himself inside and slammed the door shut. He sat in the driver's seat, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to catch his breath. The parking lot was deserted and there was no sign of the man. Just as he thought it was all over, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message or a call. But what he saw froze him with fear. The screen of his phone was showing a live stream, in black and white, from the back seat of his own car. Leonardo looked into the rear-view mirror, his heart in his throat. And there he was, the man in the hoodie sitting in the back seat, his hood pulled low, watching him silently. Before he could do anything, the phone screen went dark, and Leonardo was left alone, trapped in his own car, knowing there was no escape.